What's going on, guys? It's the Unhinged Engineer here. And in case it wasn't clear from the several videos I made on the topic, I am an aerospace engineer, both by education and by trade. I'm currently working as an aerospace engineer in 2026. Last year, I had a very interesting experience with the aerospace job market. For several reasons I've discussed on this channel, it came time to look for a new job, and I was actually pretty hesitant and almost scared to start sending out job applications, doing interviews, etc. And the reason for that was I'd heard lots and lots of horror stories about how terrible the job market was, both on the internet and even from people I know from industry or went to school with. Thankfully, I was browbeat enough by some other friends to actually start applying, and I wound up being incredibly lucky. I got interviews almost immediately and had a job offer I accepted, and I'm still currently working and loving within a couple months of starting my job hunt. I was incredibly lucky. I know not everybody's that lucky, and so the variety of experiences of people within the aerospace engineering field makes it really, really difficult to determine the health of the job market and overall, can you actually get a job in it in 2026? And so to the best of my ability, I'm going to try to answer that question in this video. So this is going to be a very data-driven video. I'm going to have a lot more charts and plots than I usually do in my videos, so I'll try not to bore you. But I'm going to start off talking about data overall. First, about aerospace engineering employment, then from there shifting away from jobs specifically into the aerospace industry writ large. And once I've laid out all the numbers, which ultimately you can find on the internet if you would like, I've just compiled them for you. Once we've laid out all those numbers, I'll get into my anecdotal experience as a working professional within this field and try to share some insight with that. Once we've gone through all that data and ultimately talk about, do we actually think we can get a job? I'll talk about the things we can do based on this information to maximize our chances of getting an aerospace engineering job in 2026, like I did in 2025. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So if you go on the American Bureau of Labor Statistics website, you can find that aerospace engineering has a projected job growth of 6% over the next decade, so 2024 to 2034. You can see in the bottom right there, that's about average for engineering, and engineering as a whole is performing like more than twice as well as all occupations across the United States. Overall, engineering is a desirable field, and aerospace engineering within that seems to hold true. That 6% employment growth equates to about a 4,500 jobs per year rate, meaning that 4,500 new jobs are opening up in this field every year. That equates to that 6% employment growth. Now, something a little more negative to talk about is that there were about 3.3 thousand layoffs in the aerospace industry in 2025. Talking specifically about private industry, not including government, which you'll see why in a moment if you don't see it already. If you look towards the bottom here, that's where aerospace is listed out. You can see in the red that 2025 number, 3.3 thousand, but there were 30,000 in 2024. And they even call out Boeing as an example here, laying off 2,500 workers in the United States. As far as I can remember, there were lots and lots of layoffs that year within aerospace engineering, as there were in several other fields like technology, mainly due to correcting for overhiring in 2020. So people were hiring like hotcakes in 2020. They grew really bloated. After that attract part of the cycle had ended, the extract kicked in, and suddenly cost reduction was a priority. Ultimately, people got laid off, which is obviously very, very unfortunate. But thankfully, 2025 had 10 times less layoffs in aerospace than it did in 2024, which is great. Less great is this government number, which is mainly driven by Doge. I'm not going to get into Doge here. We don't really talk about politics on this channel. But needless to say, there was lots of turmoil within government agencies during this year. Now, I actually did work in technically a government agency in 2025 for the first half before picking up that new job I referred to earlier. And we did notice for sure, all this is just to say like that 3.3 is a pretty optimistic number. There are probably others who may have worked at agencies that are not included in that number and would definitely be considered aerospace engineers or got that education. Okay, something else to note here is that aerospace engineering has a very high turnover rate of 13%. Now that's about 3.5 times the national average. In other words, we just discussed layoffs, which is people involuntarily leaving their jobs in aerospace engineering. Turnover is people voluntarily leaving their jobs. So that is like a good thing and a bad thing, as we'll discuss throughout this video, but it's just worth noting that aerospace has a very high churn. Now, that doesn't really track. People could have just gone from one aerospace engineering job to another, or they could have exited aerospace and gone to something like tech. Again, these are all themes I'll talk about in the anecdotal section. Yeah, just a few numbers to think about in terms of aerospace engineering jobs. Doesn't lay out the whole picture, but kind of sets the context well. The aerospace engineering industry is projected to grow about 8% over the next decade. Right? In 2025, as you can see in the bottom right, it grew about 1%. So obviously that's shy of the larger 8% number, but still it did grow, it didn't contract as compared to other industries you may see in the news. I will say, like, industry is defined very, very broadly here. That includes aviation, it includes spacecraft, it includes manufacturing, it includes R&D, it includes just about every possible category of aerospace engineer you could think of. Again, this is where that kind of core thesis of people who are bullish on aerospace engineering jobs, to me, feels like an oversimplification. These things fluctuate a lot based on industry, based on technical field, based on geography, based on years of experience. It's not convincing enough to just say, well, the aerospace engineering industry is growing, therefore aerospace engineers are going to have a good time looking for jobs. It's just not going to be true for everyone, unfortunately. One thing I will call out here is that the defense industry CAGR, and I should have said earlier, CAGR stands for compound annual growth rate, is specifically 3.6%. I couldn't find a specific number on how much that grew in 2025, but given a few reasons I'll talk about in the anecdotal section, I would believe that's much closer to the projection over the next 10 years versus the industry as a whole. That 1.1 number is shy of 7.8. Speaking of R&D, there was actually a strong patent growth in 2025. I have a chart that goes up to 23 in the bottom left here that specifically talks about space transport, but just to drive home the point that, look, there's lots and lots of new technology being developed within aerospace. It's not simply maintaining and manufacturing old systems, right? We're designing new stuff, we're testing, and ultimately we're shipping them out to customers, which is pretty cool to see. So if you're interested in R&D and you want to do something like grad school or work at a research institute, this is definitely a good time. It's just something worth noting. Okay, now anecdotal data. All those numbers, like, you can find on the internet, but I'm assuming you want to hear the experience of someone who's actually working in this field, working with other people in this field. What's it actually like for people on the inside? Well, overall, I'm seeing lots and lots of growth, specifically in the startup space. I will say I'm biased because I do work in an aerospace startup, but nonetheless, like, it feels like every Tuesday I see a new company being incorporated and several other ones even going IPO, right? And speaking of that, lots of growth stage startups, so like on the order of hundreds of employees versus tens, are expanding really, really rapidly. If you're looking for job recs, you won't have to look far if you're interested in working in an aerospace engineering startup, which is pretty cool. Again, I don't touch on politics at all on this channel, but recent world events, interpret that how you will, are driving lots of people and money to defense markets, right? There are probably several examples over 2025 and even years before that you could think of. One I will call out here is NATO pledging to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. So what the hell am I talking about? Well, last year, all NATO countries pledged to raise their defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. I believe those numbers are hovering around 1 or 2%. I don't remember specifically. Effectively, you could think of like a lot of these European countries, almost all of them, in fact, their defense spending, if these goals are to be hit, which is a giant caveat, will actually more than double in the next 10 years. That will lead to a lot of job growth within this field. So that's just like one kind of relatively tame example of world events that are driving people to the defense industry. I'm sure you could think of lots of less tame ones, but I'll leave that out. Another one that's potentially controversial, paradigm shifts in defense acquisition and procurement. So I have on the bottom right here a snippet from communications by the Department of War. And by the way, in case you didn't know, the Department of Defense was changed to the Department of War in 2025. There's another world event worth talking about. The Department of War communicating about changes in how they're going to acquire and procure defense systems from industry. And effectively, you can see in the bottom right, they lay out like their 5 pillars here: rebuilding the defense industrial base, aka investing in private markets; powering the workforce, which is aerospace engineers; reduce regulations and process; high performance systems to rigorous enterprise technical excellence, which effectively means more performance gates for companies actually selling products to the government rather than long form cost plus contracts, which is something I've discussed in previous videos. And then lastly, life cycle risk management, aka trimming the fat. All this is just to say there's lots and lots of flux in how the government, which at least in America is the biggest customer by far for aerospace and defense products, buys those products. And naturally, all this investment in the private space is going to lead to more jobs, at least hopefully. A couple other things to discuss here. I talked about that turnover, but to me, that turnover is actually a positive, at least for young, kind of closer to entry-level professionals like us. Aerospace has a known brain drain problem, right? What do I mean by this? Well, aerospace is a very, very cyclical industry, and there was a winter for a little while in the early 2000s, getting up to like mid-2010s, where there wasn't really a lot of aerospace activity going on. This is where we were launching Americans on the Soyuz. All the Apollo programs had been over for several years. We weren't in any kind of Cold War, and America's main adversary, which mainly, America was involved in the global war on terror, they didn't have any space systems of their own. And so any space systems that were deployed were mainly in service of ground combat. All this is just to say, in 2015, SpaceX starts to fly Falcons every given Tuesday, and since then we're in this roaring aerospace boom. What does that mean? What it means is there's a lot of older talent that stayed in the field during that kind of winter, but not people who entered in the field during that kind of winter. Because naturally, when there's less money flowing into an industry, there's also less people. And so you kind of have this like bimodal distribution of people like late in their career and then people early in their career and not a whole lot in the middle. This is a known problem. This is something I've seen firsthand myself in several jobs I've worked previously. I think that this brain drain problem actually poses a really great opportunity for people entering into the aerospace job market. There's gonna be a lot of jobs. I know those jobs will all be senior, and especially with AI, it may stay that way, but nonetheless, kind of the top is opening up. High-performing people will trickle upwards, right? And that will make room for everybody else. Although hopefully we're all high performers on this channel. We take those W's. One other thing to note is that tech is becoming less desirable. This brain drain problem is not as bad anymore because during that early 2000s, right? What was that the golden age of? That was the golden age of social media. All these companies are blowing up and the money and talent is flowing towards that industry. That's not really the case anymore. As you saw in the layoffs chart, tech is really, really struggling. I've discussed it on this channel. And so, the aerospace engineering industry is healthy, but again, there's this brain drain problem that on the one hand is worrying for people seeking out mentorship. I know I definitely am. Mentorship is huge, but on the other hand, it does pose opportunities with new jobs for new entrants. One more thing to talk about here. New geographic hubs emerging. So aerospace requires a lot of equipment, a lot of land, and a lot of money. And so naturally, aerospace activity kind of clusters around certain cities and certain regions. All I'm trying to get at here is, there are lots of companies that are leaving states like California and Colorado, which are classical kind of aerospace hubs, and moving to other parts of the country, like Alabama's a big one. Space Command was just moved there in 2025. Ohio, companies like Anduril are opening massive plants in Ohio for manufacturing systems. Pittsburgh is a huge one for robotics, but also for aerospace and autonomous vehicles. Lots of legacy there with Carnegie Mellon. And Atlanta, there's several other ones I don't have listed here, right? Austin, there's another one that's really good. Because again, that whole oversimplification thing, aerospace is growing especially strong in certain parts of the country. And I would highly, highly encourage you to go try to find those parts of the country if you're looking for jobs. Because it really, really does help, not just for the next job you're looking for, but the one after that. Okay, so I laid out all the data. I've talked about my anecdotal experience. Now, on this channel, I really believe, if you're a strong enough candidate, if you're a strong enough interview, you can get a job in any field. And so I do strongly believe that despite some of the negative statistics and some of the concerning dynamics we talked about, there is lots and lots of aerospace engineering activity that we could slot ourselves into and ultimately find a job in this field that we love. If you take nothing else away from this video about whether aerospace is growing or shrinking, it's definitely bubbling, right? There's lots of turmoil, there's lots of change going on, and all of that change opens up opportunity for young, dynamic, hardworking people like us. And so overall, I did want to lay out the statistics because factuality is very important. I also want to talk about my experience because hopefully that's a little bit more unique. Overall, I think aerospace engineering is a great field. I don't plan on leaving anytime soon, and I do think that if you're looking for an entry into this field, then now is as good a time as any. It's never the perfect time, right? There's always going to be some crap going on that can make finding a new job more difficult, more scary. But ultimately, the law of large numbers is on your side, right? Aerospace is a very, very large field, and so you can find your way if you're open to things that you might not have thought about initially, and you're hardworking, a good candidate, etc. How do we maximize our chances of actually getting a job within this, right? Now, there's two kinds of things I want to talk about here. One is skill sets, and the other is industries. And again, I'm going to make a larger video about how to actually get an aerospace engineering job in 2026. It will probably be one of many. How you perform really well in a job market changes over time, and I'll try to keep you guys abreast of any of those changes. Starting off with skill sets here, Like AI is obviously a huge one. I'm not going to sit here and shill learning how to use Copilot. Obviously, people who learn how to use AI tools are more effective and are faster and are better candidates, right? Aside from that stuff, something that's actually near and dear to me is not just us using AI to build aerospace systems, but the actual usage of AI within these systems. Now, another thing worth talking about in future videos is that technologies generally have adoption curves, and those adoption curves are usually phase shifted as a function of many things. In the aerospace example and other ones like biomedical technologies, chief among them being safety. Enterprise SaaS has lower risk if, some LLM goes rogue than a drone with munitions on it, right? Flying around, with civilians and with friendlies and with adversaries that may not be targets all in a vicinity, right? You really want to understand and be able to predict what these autonomous systems will do. And so naturally, we are earlier on in the adoption curve of AI into aerospace than other fields you may see, in which it's actually saturated at this point. I would say in terms of chatbots, pretty damn saturated. Aerospace, it has become almost ubiquitous at this point. We're hitting that critical mass, that saturation soon, but we're not quite there yet as compared to other fields. Aside from AI, so that's how do we embrace AI to be a better candidate? How do we insulate ourselves against AI? Now, one thing that's really neat about aerospace is that aerospace is a 100-year-old industry. LLMs, as we generally consider them, are less than a decade old. There's lots of aerospace knowledge, aerospace industry-specific knowledge that's not, even if it is technically feasible by these LLMs, getting them to actually perform to, again, that high level of technical rigor that aerospace really demands inherently is incredibly difficult. And so if you know that stuff and you can execute with that information, you're going to be incredibly desirable. And so again, there's industry insight here as one example. Low-level programming is always huge, talking about rigor and safety. C++ is a lot harder for LLMs to do reliably than something like Python, and the risks are higher, right? Both at the software level and at the physical level. And the last part, operational experience, right? Have you actually, maybe you were in the military or you were in the field deploying these systems or testing, have you actually used these systems as the customer will be using them, right? That's really hard to codify in an AI model. That's kind of a human experience. So having that experience is incredibly valuable. And just as a random example, I have on the bottom right, the Shield AI MQ-35 VBAT, right? It's one of their several autonomous drone products. And, if you think about this vehicle, there's probably lots and lots of autonomy, lots of software, lots of AI algorithms running both on-prem and also in the cloud. And then you can even see the guy on that aircraft carrier or flight deck or whatever it is, actually operating these drones is a very different experience. Standing there looking up at the propellers versus coding algorithms for it up, in a climate controlled office space. So all this is just to say there's lots of flux and change again going on because of AI, which does pose opportunities for people able to capitalize on it. And the last thing to talk about here is industries. UAVs are obviously huge for several reasons. Space is really opening up as launch costs come down. SpaceX, but also other companies, are driving the cost of launch down and the accessibility of launches up. And so naturally, there's lots of opportunity to fly cool stuff in space. Other than that, kind of adjacent fields, electronic warfare is huge. Directed energy weapons and RF interference are a big part of counter UAS, counter UAV, robotics, kind of moving away from that aerial part and actual land robotics. Although technically drones are considered robots, whatever, you get the point. Robotics kind of being related to aerospace and hiring a lot of aerospace, there's lots of opportunity there. Look, there's lots of conflicting information about how well the aerospace engineering job market is doing. My goal for this video was never to paint a clear picture of yes, you definitely can find a job and it'll be super easy and fun and painless. Or no, you're doomed, we're never gonna be able to find a job, we're all gonna be unemployed. The reality is it's never that simple. However, I do believe that all of this change and growth within the aerospace industry does pose lots of opportunities that people can seize in order to get the aerospace engineering job they want. And if you are looking for more information on how to get the aerospace engineering job you want, then you have stumbled upon the right channel. I am the Unhinged Engineer. I make professional development content for not just aerospace engineers, but also other engineers like people working in tech, people working as mechanical or chemical or civil engineers, right? If you're a young professional working in the engineering field and are looking for advice, not from somebody who went through it 20 years ago, but from somebody going through it right now in real time, and again, this is definitely the channel for you. I'm the Unhinged Engineer. Please like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.